And as you heard in the introduction, I am from Brisbane, and I say yes to any opportunity to come up and do some public speaking here in Brisbane. But this one was especially significant. My Queensland and Catholic roots run quite deep, and there'll be a point to this, I promise, but hear me out. My great-great-grandfather, and I'm sure this is a story many of you in the room have, but my great-great-grandfather, Thomas Plunkett, came out from Ireland in 1863, and that's only 4 years after Queensland was a separate colony from New South Wales, and only about 20 years after Brisbane had become a free settlement. Plunkett established a farm in countryside that is now just to the south of Beaudesert, and gave the properties that they settled down there unmistakably Irish names like Waterford and Kerry. And we had a massive family reunion down there when I was a kid, and literally 400 people showed up. It was crazy. And then the number of times I'll be walking around Brisbane and you discover you're actually distant related to someone. Enrights and Brennans and O'Gormans and good deep Irish Catholic roots that frankly at one point really did define the social fabric of Brisbane and indeed of the state of Queensland, perhaps a little less so today. Back in Ireland, though, the Plunkett family had a long and rich connection to Irish history and politics, dating back to at least the 17th century. And in the early 20th century, Plunkett's helped lead the Irish Republican movement, establishing independence from England. And my ancestor, the first one to come out to Australia, was no doubt mindful of his family's history back in Ireland and was active in politics here in Queensland, serving as a member of the Queensland Legislative Assembly for decades, and indeed so too did one of his sons, also named Thomas. One of Plunkett's daughters, Mary, married an enterprising young Irish immigrant named Richard Jackman, who took over a butcher business in Sandgate, and that's where my last name comes from. Robert Jackman and Mary Jackman, Mary Plunkett, raised the family in a house known as Stella Maris, Star of the Sea, up on the headland at Shorncliffe, adjacent to what is now St Patrick's College. And then their son, also named Thomas, he was born in 1901, went up the terrace, coming down from Sandgate, back when that was a long way, and so he was a boarder. And then when he left, he went back to Sandgate and took over the butchery business. He married a woman named Meta Brennan, and then they had some kids down in Sandgate, one of whom is my dad. The two eldest boys attended Nudgee. I had an aunt, great aunt Julia, became a sister of Mercy. And I remember those car trips fondly as a kid. The front seat would do the first half of Hail Mary, the back seat would finish the Hail Mary for a safe trip. And if it was a long trip, we'd go for a whole decade of the Rosary. But she was a remarkable woman, and the reason I know as much as I do about our long Irish Catholic history is really her. She took it on herself to inform the rest of the family about those roots that reach right back to Ireland, and on the side would remind us of what it was like for Catholics in the early days of Queensland, and indeed the not so early days of Queensland, indeed in living memory. There is a sectarian history to Queensland that I think is thankfully in the rear view mirror, but something that I think we ought to not forget. And certainly Aunt Julia in my family was the keeper of that history. But on the Irish side, the thing that really got her excited as a nun was the opportunity to lead a pilgrimage to Rome in pursuit of the canonization of a distant ancestor, Oliver Plunkett, who had been beatified in the 1920s, but was canonized, became a saint in 1975. And he, of course, was Primate of all Ireland, 1669, until his especially gruesome death as the last Catholic martyr at Tyburn in 1681. And Julia taught us all that when we weren't saying Hail Marys in the car. She really took it on herself to really draw the clans, the Plunkett clans together, and made sure all of the kids in our childhood, and you know, I was hand up. I was 9 years old in 1975. Incredibly impressionable on a kind of a nerdy kid to get exposed to that legacy that we were in some ways the inheritors of. I know my grandfather took that especially seriously. He was a very serious Catholic, lay Catholic, is perhaps the way to talk about it. He and a number of Catholic businessmen around Sandgate they had these huge broods of kids, all these boys needing an education, and girls too, although I think, it was a sign of the times they were more animated by what to do with their son's education. And they were sick of sending kids to Nudgee and Terrace, so they got this great idea for a day school down on the north side of Brisbane, and that was the genesis of St. Pat's, Shorncliffe, in 1952. And 3 of my uncles went to St. Pat's. One of my uncles was in the founding class and was Ducks and college captain of that class. My dad, his name is Thomas, and his brother Paul, they took over the butcher's business in Sandgate, and I attended Catholic schools all the way through St. Dipner's in Aspley. No? Yes, there we go. Sacred Heart Convent in Sandgate? No. Come on, really? Okay, and St. Pat's at Shorncliffe. Yes, thank you, St. Paddy's. SBC, green and gold. Very good. And that was great. I was there for 4 years, from the 4th grade to the 12th grade, as were my brothers behind me, and very conscious of that legacy that our family had been instrumental in helping found the school, and that was both a blessing but a curse as well. Don't embarrass the family. And if we got in trouble at school, by God, we got in trouble at home as well. It's sort of the scars of that still run a little deep. But Mum and Dad raised us in Bracken Ridge back when that was still farmland. That's hard to imagine, given what's going on out there now. And again, following a long tradition of the Catholic Church, the church followed its people out to Bracken Ridge. And in what was an abandoned farmhouse, about 100 metres from the house that Mum and Dad were raising us in, services started on a Sunday morning. Mass was being celebrated in this strange old abandoned farmhouse where 20 of us were in the old living room and 20 of us were in the old lounge room. And literally that's where we had Mass up there at Bracken Ridge for about a good year or so before they built what is now St. Joseph's up on the top of the hill there at Bracken Ridge. And it's now a school as well up there. The local community around the church discovered that I had some musical talent, and I began playing the piano in 1977. So roughly for 5 years, I was still going to uni when I was just living in St. Lucia. By then it got a bit hard to continue to do it, but I was playing piano about once a month on a Sunday morning up at St. Joseph's, Bracken Ridge. And that was amazing because it was brand new. I don't know if it was a brand new parish necessarily, certainly a brand new church, and a brand new community is the more important point. A new suburb, new families, and this real opportunity for you sort of thinking about these remarks today. What was that about? That was about building community. That was the opportunity that presented to that group of Catholics, to the church. And it was the 70s, and there was a sense that, let's experiment a little bit with the liturgy and elements of the liturgy. And here's this kid who's 12 years old and can play the piano, so let's get rid of the organ and let him play piano. And that was great. And it was a very active and energizing time. As I look back on it, I was a kid, but now as an adult, I can kind of transpose onto the grown-ups as they were, sort of what was going on there, this sense of real opportunity and possibility and creativity in helping get this community up. And I keep coming back to that word community because that's what it was and is. And it's something that the Catholic Church has been doing, frankly, for millennia, accompanying its people where they go, from Ireland to Australia, from the inner city out to the suburbs, and increasingly into new parts of the globe as well. And And when you build a church, it's also that community building that goes on. You supply resilience, you build solidarity, among Catholics, to be sure, in the first instance, but in so doing, you make those places stronger and better places, not just for the Catholics who are there and attending services and whatnot, but for everybody, frankly. And that goal and those outcomes are precisely those that bring you here to this organisation, not an association, but an assembly of Catholic professionals. And I think that's incredibly significant. The size of this group, the word assembly is more appropriate than an association. And so I want to thank you for letting me come and make a small contribution to keeping that community going, if only for the opportunity of pulling you together for an hour or two to listen to me. Now, with that, I want to put a line under that now and turn to the advertised subject matter. And that's the way that religion and politics intersect and don't in both Australia and the United States. And in so doing, I'm breaking all the rules of polite conversation. We'll be delving into 2 of 3 taboo topics you're supposed to never discuss, religion and politics, and we'll skirt around the 3rd one as well, by the way. But I get paid danger money to do that. I'm a professor of political science. And we make fun of the sociologists, which we say is the science of what goes on between consenting adults. But politics, particularly in this day and age, takes us into that territory. Talking about religion, politics, its intersection with what's going on in the world. And so I do this for a living, so bear with me. I would not elevate religion to being the most important political cleavage in the United States at the moment. That honour belongs to race. The colour of one's skin, as a demographic fact, is a powerful predictor of political affiliation in the United States. And among white people in America, your attitudes about racial justice or racial injustice, or what ought to be done about those things, powerfully predicts whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. I would begin there in characterising the broad landscape of American politics at the moment before I would get to denomination per se. And I've got a little bit of data to support some of this in a little bit later. Denominational differences are relevant, to be sure, but the bigger cleavage that relates to religion in American politics is not so much between Catholics and Protestants or other religious faiths, but between people of faith and people who describe themselves as not believing in God, atheists, open or agnostic, when we get to that part of the survey or the census or whatever it might be. That cleavage has become more politically consequential in the United States than denominational differences. And that says something about what's happened to American religion, both American Catholicism and American Protestant religion as well. And that, and I've got a little, I don't know if I'll show you this, but so I'll just describe it. It reflects a shift to the right among people of faith, irrespective of denomination, in the Christian faiths, irrespective of denomination, over the last 20 or 30 years. That says something about, I think, a crisis in American Catholicism at the moment. One that is, I think, less profound, to be sure, by a long stretch, when we look back at Australian religion and its role in structuring political competition and political conflict. It is in no small measure, and I think we have to confront this, it is in no small measure driven by year after year of bad news with respect to institutionalised sexual abuse and the responses to that. That has hardly been a good news story, and has just been so demoralising to huge cohorts of American Catholics. What's happened is that a sort of a moderate centre politically, even left of centre, Catholics have found their faith challenged and have found their faith to be less relevant to them when they describe who they are. Right? That's who's sort of exiting in a slow motion kind of way the church in terms of a way that people talk about themselves. What are you? Are you a white person? Are you, what is your religious affiliation? And that tends to be, so over time what you see is who's still describing themselves as a Catholic tends to, over time, through attrition, has migrated to the right a little bit on a left-right political dimension. So much so that American Catholics are to the right of Australian Catholics as a group, not one-to-one, but if we were to characterise those two sets of people as groups, we would identify we would locate American Catholics to the right of Australian Catholics. But there is one group more conservative than American Catholics, and that's American Protestants, who are way to the right of, well, every group we identified in the set when you do like-to-like comparisons, Australian denominations to American. But Australians to Americans by religious denomination might be the best way to describe what I've got in mind here. We line groups up on a left-right spectrum, and out on the right rather, we put American Protestants first. Those two groups, though, in both countries are closer to one another on a left-right axis than people who profess not to have faith. Right? And those groups are quite close to one another. I can ask a bunch of survey questions, and we do this, to Americans and Australians about political preferences, where they line themselves up on a left-right spectrum. Compare the results. People who say they have no religious affiliation or they're atheist or agnostic, they're quite similar to one another in the two countries. It's really quite remarkable. And moreover, they are the biggest group, the single biggest group. They're not a majority, but they are the single biggest group in both countries now, which is unusual. That's the other trend in the United States. The United States, I used to say, is a first world economic power, but with the levels of religiosity of Costa Rica, right? And in terms of, it used to be that you could barely crack single digits if you ask Americans, do you believe in God? Americans would about 98%, 92% would say yes, 92-8 split you'd get on that. That is now down to about 85-15. And by the way, in Australia, 40% of Australians say they don't have a view, they don't believe in God, or they don't think about it much. It's just no view on that. And that's a little on the high side for an advanced industrial country, but totally in line with what you might see in a European country, right? The United States remains quite exceptional on that, and it's that difference between believers and non-believers rather than Catholic versus Protestant or anything like that. That tends to be of more political consequence, again, for the reasons I just said, about what's the dynamics of what's been going on in American Catholicism and in American Protestantism, for that matter as well. I might flip to the deck at this point, if I can, just to put a bit of flesh on this. So we, at the US Study Centre, just ran a survey in July in both countries, 1,800 people in Australia, 1,800 people in the United States. When we just classify the responses about religious affiliation, this is what we got. The Australian results, they're from a survey, it's not the census. The census in 2016, Australia had Catholicism up a little higher, about 22%. But for a survey, we're sort of in the ballpark. And ours, I think, subsets to adult citizens, so that might account for why the numbers are a little lower when we subset to Australian citizens. But look at those numbers on the single biggest group in both countries, as I said, people that profess no religious affiliation, and a subset of them saying they're actually agnostic or atheist or whatever. That's up to 43% in Australia, but running 10 points higher than it runs in the United States, where Protestantism is a bigger group there. as are the prevalence of faiths like Mormonism, Judaism, and that explains sort of why there's a slight bump relative to Australia in other. So that's sort of the lay of the land. Then we go to sort of how does that map onto vote? And the interesting thing about this is that I was a little surprised by this. I was expecting a pretty flat gradient with respect to religious affiliation and how people say they vote in Australia. But it turns out there's a little bit of a gradient there. Catholics report 42% voting for the coalition versus 55% among people that say they're Protestant. This is in the last election. That's a 13-point split. You look on the Labor side, there's a 6-point split. Catholics in this survey, 30% of them say they voted Labor versus only 24% of Protestants. And you can see this point I was making earlier, but the bigger difference is with respect to what's going on with people that don't profess a religious affiliation at all. Their coalition support falls to about 1 in 4, 24%. That's the group where the Greens does the best, perhaps no surprise. And the Labor vote is also the demographic that and Labor are where are where Labor does best. Now, if we go to the United States, here we're asking people to remember how they voted in 2016, and so there's a little, you've got to take that with a tiny grain of salt. Here, what's interesting is the Trump vote. There's only, between Catholics and Protestant, there's only a 5-point split. Right? And that's my point earlier about what's been happening to American Catholicism. People who are self-describing themselves as Catholics in the United States these days look a little more right-wing, a little more conservative, on average. This is not a blanket statement, but on average, a little more to the right than they would have if we had to run these numbers 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And like I said, it comes back to some of the dynamics at work inside the church in the United States. There's not much of a gradient a partisan gradient with respect to remembering if you voted for Clinton. And again, if we go to this group of people who say they have no religious affiliation, that's where we see the Democrats doing the best, 46%. And again, not a dissimilar story in broad landscape to the Australian story, although I've got to say I was really surprised by the steepness, if you will, of this 13-point difference, and something we're certainly going to be kicking the tires on and seeing if we can replicate that in other work. But a really interesting counterpoint to the United States. Now, onto a topic that's a little part of the story here, and really does animate politics in the United States, and that is around abortion. The top half of the table there shows you the responses from Australian respondents, and look at the column labelled all. 60% of Australians say that by law a woman should always be able to obtain an abortion as a matter of personal choice. And we show them all these options at once, so they're able to just pick which option they want. Even in face-to-face interviewing, we don't read these out loud, or I don't like to do these on the phone. Face-to-face, we will hand someone a piece of paper and ask them to select which one. It's a very sensitive matter. Online surveys are a little more anonymous, but that's the way we give them all the options and ask them to pick one. 60%, roughly 6 in 10 Australians take, if you will, this more permissive of the set of 4 options. That does drop among Catholics, about 10 points, running 10 points behind the population average, but almost 50% of Catholics select that option. Among people who aren't professing faith, that goes up to almost 3 in 4, and not much partisan gradient there at all. Religious denominational gradient there at all. Only a 4-point difference with Protestants, who are the most, and I don't know what to make it if that 4-point difference is statistically significant, but an interesting thing to observe nonetheless. If we flip to the United States, we see a couple of big differences. First of all, that overall level of support for the most permissive view on abortion, 58% in Australia, drops right down to 42% in the United States, with more support for these more restrictive sort of views about the availability of abortion. And while in Australia, 16% of respondents said the law should only permit abortion in the case of rape, incest, or when the woman's life is in danger, the corresponding proportion in the United States is 10 percentage points higher. 26%, more than 1 in 4 Americans hold that view. Among people who profess a religious denomination, religious affiliation, and in particular these Christian affiliations, those proportions go up to about 1 in 3 as opposed to about 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 in Australia. And this reveals sort of some of the greater oomph this issue has in the United States, and in turn speaks to, I think, part of how it is that Donald Trump is president. What's this got to do with how Donald Trump is president? What this has to do with Donald Trump being president is that the courts are still a live arena of contestation on the issue of abortion in the United States, and the courts are things that presidents get to control to some extent through the appointments they make. And a number of, and how it is that, I haven't run the numbers on who would you like to be president among Australian respondents, but I know the answer. Overall, if we ask Australians, who would you like to win would you like to see Donald Trump re-elected president in 2020? And 19% of Australians say they'd like that. 19, right? But among Americans, how is it that a man who's divorced, a man who was captured on tape boasting about sexual assault, won 46% of the votes of Protestants and 41% of the votes of Catholics? How did that happen? That's happened because he promised to make conservative appointments to the courts, and that is code for we are going to put enough momentum in a slow motion kind of way through judicial appointments that one day we will revisit Roe v. Wade. And that is the implicit bargain between Christian denominations in particular and Republican candidates for office in the United States at the moment. Now, why is that true? And here I'll sort of conclude with just a few closing observations about some key differences between the two countries. Why isn't that happening here? Why isn't that happening here? It's a really great question. Why is the politics of abortion? Well, for one thing, it's a more settled matter. The numbers are a little more settled on this matter in Australia. The other thing is just the institutional differences between the countries, between the two countries. And here I come back to compulsory voting. It is such a game changer that the political parties in Australia do not have to mobilise voters. Right? You're going to get a fine if you don't vote. Right? I'm going to get a fine if I don't vote. That changes the strategic calculus of political parties markedly. For centuries, churches have been arenas of political mobilisation. Quite literally, politicians go there and they have a captive audience. Right? And glomming onto churches as a way to get to a bunch of voters all at once who are organised, are voting with their feet, they care about some stuff because they're getting up on a Sunday morning, right, and coming to a place, so they're motivated. And boy, if they could do that on a Sunday morning, they might be able to do it on a Tuesday lunchtime to vote. So already there's something there. And there's organisation. There are things like newsletters and, right? So churches historically in the United States, like other forms, there are others, right? But churches, because of their deep roots in the community, how pervasive they are, how highly valued they are as institutions of community building, all positive things, it means that politicians are drawn to them in the United States like bees to honey. And that is part of that need to mobilise voters around issues that those voters care about. is such a big part of the story of American politics right now. And why you hear characterizations of American politics in terms of base politics. Because base voters care about things. Base voters will get off their backsides and vote, right? Whereas it's a risky bet. I mobilize someone who's kind of in the middle. I'm spending all this money reaching out to them, and then they don't vote because they don't care that much. Oh, they actually vote, but for the wrong side. They voted for the other party. And so the incentives to play to the base and find issues that mobilize the base are just so profound in American politics. And Australia, I think, is a healthier place for not having that be part of the political calculus. Now, it's not that politicians ignore the churches here in Australia, right? Far from it. But there's an altogether different strategic calculus underway about converting voters or delivering a message to voters who are already going to vote, rather than having to find something that's going to so enliven them that they would engage in this act on a Tuesday that they might not otherwise engage in. And that is part of what is both, and you have to think about politics not just from the grassroots up, but it is an economics metaphor, a supply meeting a demand. A politician needs voters to turn out and vote. The politician is in the supply business, supplying issues that sometimes divide us, sometimes unite us, but sometimes divide us. Why? They want to get elected, or they like to stay elected, right? And thinking through the strategic calculus of American politics and politicians with weaker party systems where the campaigns are less nationalized. Sure, there's the presidency, but issues that play well in the American South where religious affiliation and in particular the Protestant faiths are extremely well represented. All of that is sort of being conducted almost by a bunch of free agents. The parties are much less organised. There's much less ability for head office to exert control on the messaging going off out there in Alabama or Mississippi or Missouri or California. Right? And so it is entirely open to local parties in a way that, again, there's a bit more organisation and discipline in Australian politics that will stop that kind of wildcatting on issues. There's a lot more control. So that's enough if you, sort of talking about American politics, but I did want to, it is so central to what we do at the US Study Centre, helping Australians understand what's different or similar about the United States, and holding the US up against the Australian experience is a great counterpoint for us. So it is our stock in trade, and we keep coming back to the institutional differences, things that are sort of baked in the pie, and I think things that we would tinker with at our peril, and for me that's compulsory turnout. I know it seems a technical thing on the books and it's been there for a long time, but I want you to imagine for a moment, just imagine Australian politics without compulsory voting. Imagine who's coming to the P&F a little more frequently than they might be now. Imagine who's looking to get on this platform perhaps a little more ardently than they might now. And not just seeking your support, but probably seeking your money too. Right? It changes so much, so that's why I spend so much time talking about it. Look, the last observation I want to make before I stop and open it up to some Q&A is to just briefly reflect on this organisation and just a few lessons learned from my own career. This is a group of professionals, a group of Catholic professionals. So what's the significance of that? And I just did want to conclude with a few observations on that. Faith and values play, for me, reflecting personally now, and something I wanted to share with this group, an increasingly important role as I've gone from being a callow 20-year-old and 30-year-old to being a father, a husband, and now a leader of an organisation. My professional arc has corresponded with greater ethical demands on me and greater demands on that kick back into the home as well. I've felt that burden for a long time, not just leading an organisation of about 30 people in Sydney, but as a professor, as a teacher of young people. Professional arcs do accompany other challenges, as I just mentioned, but with my professorial hat on, I learned a long time ago that communicating facts or teaching people how to analyse data was actually kind of the least of it. That reproducing a mindset was kind of the more important part of the job for me. And what I modelled to my students, the way I interacted with them and colleagues and whatnot, that becomes increasingly important over the career stage. And we're not taught to do that very well. And in Australia, men at least and women, we get to talk about our mates. Our mates we're teaching one another how to do that. But organisations like this are really important too. Particularly the mentoring role here. I see a great distribution of ages here. But teaching people how to be ethical professionals, to behave in ways consistent with what our faith and our values would demand of us, it doesn't come naturally necessarily. There's a lot that's in the DNA that predisposes humans to be decent, but there's a lot more to it than that. And associations like this can and are valuable tools in that. And that mentoring function and giving people an opportunity to talk about how their value sets interact with the choices they're making at home and increasingly for a group like this on the job, I think are really important. And that's a thought I did want to leave you guys with. It's something I think about every day, that I have an opportunity to model good standards consistent with what I learned at St. Pat's a while ago to the people that work for me. And I hope that's something that this organisation does embrace as part of its charge, particularly to the younger people coming up through the ranks in the room.